Kimberle Crenshaw is an American lawyer, civil rights activist, philosopher, and a leading scholar of critical race theory. She developed the concept of intersectionality and first wrote about it in a famous paper called Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a black feminist critique of anti-discrimination doctrine, feminist theory, and anti-racist politics in 1989. The paper was published for the University of Chicago Legal Forum. At the time the paper was published, Crenshaw had only recently graduated from Harvard Law and had taken up an academic position at the UCLA Law School. The paper takes its place as one of the most important scholarly articles on discrimination in the 20th century. The paper coins the phrase intersectionality, which has done so much to further our understanding of how systemic discrimination operates and just how insidious it is. The paper also introduces a second and equally important idea of the but-for assumption that lay at the heart of anti-discrimination legislation as it was practiced at the time. Crenshaw's paper is a true example of original thought and has done much to fuel academic understanding of systemic discrimination and took both critical race theory and feminism in a new direction. At the beginning of the paper, Crenshaw cites 3 civil rights cases brought in US courts and shows how, on each occasion, the judiciary failed to adequately treat black women who had suffered discrimination on the basis of both race and sex. She argued that in each case, the court was blind to the ways that these 2 discriminations were working to multiply marginalisation, rendering an exclusion of the black female experience in the dominant ways of thinking about and remedying discrimination. In the case of de Graffenried versus General Motors, she shows how, despite a clear case of discrimination against black women, you can't get any clearer than the fact that GM had never hired a black woman, because GM routinely hired women, white women, and black people, men, the plaintiff failed to demonstrate that GM was either discriminatory against women or black people. The court found that it couldn't apply anti-discrimination legislation to the special classification of black women because, quote, the prospect of the creation of new classes of protected minorities clearly raises the prospect of opening the hackneyed Pandora's box. That's a direct quote from the judge in this particular case. So Crenshaw describes a system at GM where white women were hired to work as secretaries and black men were hired to work on the factory floor. But there was no place for black women in the GM corporation because they couldn't be hired to work as secretaries and they couldn't be hired to work on the factory floor. And despite this, the court found that the plaintiff failed to demonstrate that discrimination had occurred because of the court's inability to see what Crenshaw calls an intersection of injustice. In the cases of Moore versus Hughes Helicopters Incorporated and Payne versus Travenel, Crenshaw describes how black women were denied the right to win certification as class representatives. In Moore, the denial meant that black women could not represent all women, including white women, and in Payne, black women were denied the opportunity to represent all blacks, including black men. In both cases, the ruling meant that black women were not able to use the right statistics that clearly showed how women and blacks were discriminated against in hiring and promotion decisions. With these 2 cases, Crenshaw demonstrates how the court effectively diluted the discrimination claims of black women by failing to see that their experience had equivalence to their white and male counterparts. Crenshaw uses the case to highlight what she calls the but-for assumption that lay at the heart of discrimination and public discourse at the time of her paper. She states, and this is a quote, underlying this conception of discrimination is a view that the wrong which anti-discrimination law addresses is the use of race or gender factors to interfere with decisions that otherwise would be fair or neutral. This process-based definition is not grounded in a bottom-up commitment to improve the substantive conditions for those who are victimised by the interplay of numerous factors. So Crenshaw's argument was that anti-discrimination legislation was written in such a way that it assumes the privileges of whiteness and maleness are neutral, and that extending those privileges to either white women or black men on the basis that they too would be privileged but for their colour or sex is somehow enlightened. She evokes the metaphor of a mass of underprivileged people that exist layered shoulder upon shoulder in a basement in such a way that otherwise privileged people, so able-bodied middle-class black men or able-bodied middle-class white women, have their heads touching the ceiling of the basement, whilst those who suffer at intersections of multiple discriminations are forced to the bottom. She states that current anti-discrimination legislation and its application in the court setting is like opening a trapdoor and helping those at the top up to the ground floor, whilst leaving the others behind. Crenshaw creates a very powerful image which effectively demonstrates the insidious nature of the intersections of injustice. In the second part of the paper, Crenshaw goes on to describe how this but-for assumption underlies much of the feminist and anti-racist discourse to the exclusion of the multiply marginalised. In relation to feminist discourse, she describes, for example, how the white feminist discourse about access to paid employment being an aspirational privilege fails to account for a generation of working-class black women who have been forced to become primary breadwinners, resulting in a complex denial of black women's femininity and creating, quote, personal, emotional, and relationship problems in black women's lives. In terms of the anti-racist discourse, perhaps the most powerful example she shares is actually from her own experience. She describes how a university friend, a black man, was admitted as one of the very first black members to an exclusive men's club which, quote, boasted memberships of several past United States presidents and other influential white males. Her friend invited her to drinks at the club to celebrate their end-of-year exams. She said, quote, anxious to see this fabled place, we approached the large door and grasped the brass ring to announce our arrival. But our grand entrance was cut short when our friend sheepishly slipped from behind the door and whispered that he'd forgotten a very important detail. My companion and I bristled, our training as black people having taught us to expect yet another barrier to our inclusion. Even an informal one, black person quota at the establishment, was not unimaginable. The tension broke, however, when we learned that we would not be excluded because of our race, but that I would have to go around the back door because I was a female. I entertained the idea of making a scene to dramatise the fact that my humiliation as a female was no less painful and my exclusion no more excusable than had we all been sent around the back door because we were black. Crenshaw's experience of being torn between wanting to rail against her humiliation but not wanting to ruin a moment of celebration for her friend is a powerful story about the marginalisation of black women's experience in anti-racist discourse and the hesitancy black women experience in calling it out. She states, quote, the racial context in which black women find themselves makes the creation of a political consciousness that is oppositional to black men difficult. Crenshaw's work in illuminating how intersectionality works to both multiply harmful discrimination and exclude the experience of the multiply marginalised from accounts of discriminatory practice cannot be underestimated. Her work on intersectionality and her calling out of the but-for assumptions present in the feminist and anti-racist discourses has enabled a great leap forward in our understanding of inclusion as it pertains to academic discourse, social justice, and corporate social responsibility.